Okay, today we're going to talk about building a sukkah. My focus, just because of the way we do things, has to do with building it for a restaurant or a caterer or something like that. But the truth is, I don't think there's much different here than for building it for a home. Not that I can think of. So we're just going to talk about what it takes to make a sukkah that should be okay, acceptable, kosher, if you want to use that word. I'm going to divide what I'm saying into three parts, and what we're saying here is based on CRC's position, as per Rabbi Reese. Others potentially think differently, more l'chomer or l'kula, but we're going to present it the way the CRC does things. Okay, first we're going to talk about location, then about the walls, and then about the schach. Okay, so the location means like this. Before you build a sukkah, first you have to scout out the area and just say, is this a good place to put up a sukkah? Okay, is this a place that is kosher, appropriate for putting up a sukkah? So the first thing is, the most unusual issue is that a sukkah must be ke'im teduru. It has to be a place where you eat like in your house. So that means as if a sukkah, if there's a bad odor, or it's too hot, or it's too cold, or there's too many bugs, or anything like that that makes it not a comfortable place to eat, a sukkah shouldn't be there. Sometimes it's so bad that it's not even kosher at all if you eat there. But it means just think about, like, we don't put it next to a garbage dump, or if it's in the middle of a swamp and it's all buggy, we wouldn't put a sukkah into that spot. Second thing is, this is more of a home issue. That is, we have to think about Shabbos and Yom Tov, and that is, the Ramah says that a person should not be eating over a grassy area, because invariably he's going to spill something on the floor, which would be a potential issue of zerveah, of making things grow on Shabbos or on Yom Tov. So for that reason, a sukkah should really be built on a patio or a porch that has cement or wood or something, some solid surface, rather than on the grass. If a person is doing it on the grass, then the preference is that there should be a tarp or something like that under the sukkah, so that something that spills won't go onto the grass; it would go onto this tarp. This is not such a relevant issue like in a restaurant, because they don't have customers on Shabbos and Yom Tov, but in a home issue it would be. Similarly for Shabbos, is that you can't carry outside. So when you put up your sukkah, you have to think about, is there an area in this area, or is this surrounded, like if it's in my backyard and there's a fence around it, then that's good also, but it has to be in a place where I'm allowed to carry, or else on Shabbos, I won't be able to use that as a good sukkah. That wouldn't pass the sukkah, just you won't be able to use it on Shabbos. Okay? But the most common and the most serious issue for most people's sukkahs is about choosing the location for the sukkah is to look overhead. And because if a sukkah needs to have schach on its roof and be then exposed overhead, above that, to the sky, and if there's something overhanging the sukkah that's not kosher for schach, like a tree or the overhang from a house, then that potentially can ruin this sukkah, or you won't be able to eat in that spot. We'll talk about that in a second. And therefore, the truth is, the best place to make a sukkah is where there's nothing overhead. Okay, in a nice open area where there's nothing hanging over the sukkah. Okay, that's not always so realistic. So now the thing is like this: if something that overhangs the schach is near one of the walls or more than one of the walls, then it depends how far the overhang is. Okay, and there's three categories. One is, if the thing that overhangs goes less than 3 tvachim, okay, as I'm going to mention a number of times here, tvachim, when we talk about it today, and for just to introduce that for 1 second, is that there's different opinions as to how big a tefach is, and therefore we are machmir in both directions. Okay, we say is a tefach is either between just over 3 inches. I'm going to use 3 inches just to be even. We'll say 3 inches, or the tefach is 4 inches. Okay, so it's someplace in between, and we follow that l'chumra in each direction. So what I'm about to say now is that if the space that it hangs over is less than 3 tvachim, then the overhang, the trees that are hanging over, or the part of the house that hangs over less than 3 tvachim, it doesn't affect the sukkah, not at all. And you can even eat under that part. You can sleep under that part. It makes no difference. Okay. So for this part, we're being machmir, and we say 3 tvachim means 9 inches. Okay, it's really a drop more, but for simplicity, I'm going to use round numbers. I'm going to say 9 inches. Okay. So if let's say it's an overhang from the house of a couple of inches, less than 9 inches, it doesn't make a difference, and the sukkah is completely kosher. If the overhang is between 3 tvachim and 4 amas, so it means it's between 9 inches up to about 6 feet, okay, give or take, up to about 6 feet, then the din is like this. The parts that are covered by the tree or the house, that part is not kosher as a sukkah. That part it's not acceptable to use as a sukkah. But it doesn't ruin the wall, and the rest of the sukkah is still kosher. So you can't eat in that spot which is now covered, but you can use the rest of the sukkah. What happens if the overhang is more than 4 amas? Then that passes the whole sukkah. Okay, that wall doesn't count. It's as if that completely doesn't exist at all, and it ruins that would ruin it for the entire sukkah. Okay, so all that I just said to you, these 3 categories of if it's less than 3 tvachim, or between 3 tvachim and 4 amas, or more than 4 amas, that's when it goes over the sides, meaning it's covering a wall and some of the schach. What happens if it's in the middle of the sukkah? Think about someone, drop a towel on top of the sukkah, on top of the schach, or put something metal on top of there. Then, meaning it's not over the walls, it's just over the center of the sukkah, then the overhang has to be less than 4 tvachim, about 12 inches or 12 and a half inches. And if it's, and there's a little bit of a difference if it's between 3 and 4, but it's got to be less than 4 tvachim. If it's less than 3, you can even eat underneath it. But more than 4 would pass the sukkah again. Okay, so now I've told you a number of ways that a sukkah could become pasul, or at least that you can't eat under certain parts of the sukkah, which is the most common is the case where it's less than 4, between 3 tvachim and 4 amas. There's a tree hanging over one side of the sukkah, or there's an overhang from the building over one part of the sukkah, and it's less than 4 amas. Okay, so in that place when it's less than 4 amas, you can't eat in that spot. So the most basic level is the people who use the sukkah need to know that part is not kosher as a sukkah. So that in a house, you tell people in the family. In a restaurant, it means that you have to tell the customers, have to know that this part of the sukkah is not kosher as a sukkah. And even better, when it's in a public place, like a restaurant that's using a sukkah, then there should be put tape down or a sign up that says, this spot from here to here is not kosher. You can't eat under the spot. Didn't ruin the sukkah, but you're not allowed to eat. If you're allowed to eat there, you're just not allowed to eat. You're not doing the mitzvah. So you can eat foods that you can eat out of the sukkah, or people who are not obligated in the mitzvah, like women, could eat there, but you're not yet to the mitzvah if you eat in that spot. Okay, now, there's another rule which has to do with location. It has to do with this thing about having trees down, and that is, there's a general rule about sukkah, which is tasav lemon asui. The Torah says, "Chag sukkah tasav." You should make a sukkah. Means a sukkah has to be created by a person. It can't just show up by itself. So the most common, most people think of when they think of tasav lemon asui is that the schach has to be put up after you have walls. You can't have schach first and put the walls later, because if that happens, then the schach is as if came into being by itself, because schach needs walls. So this schach came into being without any walls, and you put it up without walls. That wasn't kosher. And then when you put up the wall, the schach became, so to speak, in its place by itself. Nobody put them there, so that's not kosher. You have to put the schach after the walls. But that's a general rule. But for our purposes, it means the Mishmur says that you should. Shulchan Aruch says parts of this is that if you're going to be trimming trees above a sukkah, you need to trim those trees before you put the schach up, because otherwise you put up the schach and it was not kosher in that area, and now you trim the tree, the schach became kosher without a person putting it up. That wouldn't be good. The Mishnah says also that if you can have a shlach or a skylight above the sukkah, they should be open, or a awning. Those should be open when rolled back when you're putting up the schach. This way, when you're putting it up, you, a person, are putting up schach that's kosher, and therefore, and then you can put the shlach on afterwards, and do like that. Okay, if you didn't do that, if you put it in the wrong way, then once it isn't a kosher, once it's set up kosher, then you should. A Jewish person should come along and lift it up as a way of saying, as if I'm now putting it on right now. Okay, that's the end of our first section about choosing the location. Okay, so again, the main focus of location had to do with making sure we have a spot that doesn't have too much overhang. Okay, our next section is about the walls of the sukkah. So a sukkah needs to be 7 tvachim by 7 tvachim. It means it's 28 inches by 28 inches. That's the minimum size of the sukkah. You can't make one side. If you make one side a little shorter, you can't make the other one. You don't help by making the other one bigger, but that's usually not a problem. Most people don't have sukkahs that are so tiny. And usually, that's pretty easy to have 7 tvachim by 7 tvachim. But now, that area, which is 7 tvachim by 7 tvachim, needs to be surrounded by walls on at least 3 sides. Okay, and each one of those walls needs to be at least 10 tvachim tall. Over here, l'chumra, 10 tvachim means 40 inches. Okay, we take the long, bigger tefach, so it has to be 40 inches. It has to be 40 inches tall. But those walls but you have to have 3 walls, and those walls have to be 10 tvachim tall. That does not have to be a solid wall. The din is very open or forgiving as to how walls should look like, and walls don't have to be solid like we might think they would. Okay, and one big cool of that is the din of love. The din of love, it says, is that anytime there's a space that's less than 3 tvachim, 9 inches, anytime there's a space between 2 things that are less than 9 inches, it's as if that space is filled in. Okay, so for example, if I have a chain link fence, has got very little solid to it, but the space between each one of those links is less than 3 tvachim, less than 9 inches. So it's as if the wall is solid. So the din says, even though it's wide open, you could there's most of it is empty space. It's still considered to be full. Or let's say I take a wall that's a solid piece of wood that's 8 tvachim tall, and I suspend it over the floor, and I put it 2.5 tvachim off the ground. So now I have 2.5 tvachim of empty space. It's as if the din says those are like filled in. So we have 2.5 tvachim of filled-in space that they didn't filled in, plus 8 tvachim of solid wood, and that's considered a sukkah that's 10 tvachim tall. So, excuse me. So what some people do is, sort of like the chain link fence, they use something called lavud straps. What they'll do is they'll take strings and they'll put those strings around on poles, and each string will be within 3 tvachim of the next one. So the strings will be going horizontally around the sukkah area. So each string, let's say each string is 2.5 tvachim from the other one. So we said 9 inches is 3 tvachim. So each one is 8 inches from the other one. So they put strings every 8 inches all the way till they get to 40 inches high. And now they have, the din says, it's as if they have a 10 tefach wall, because the space, the 8 inches between the strings is as if it's filled in. So now, if we make enough strings high enough, it's as if we have 40 inches of fold in. We have 10 tvachim wall made really out of just a handful of strings. Just a bunch of strings running horizontally makes it filled in. Okay, so now, that works, in din that works. And there are people who do that. They call them lavud straps. There are even sukkahs that are built like that from the get-go with this lavud straps. But in doing this, you have to pay attention that the space between those straps, because it only works if the space is less than 3 tvachim between them. Okay, and just because someone designed the sukkah to be a certain way, that doesn't mean that person was being so careful. You have to pull out a tape measure yourself and make sure it actually is less than 3 tvachim. We looked at some, and actually they weren't. Some of them were pre-built, pre-designed to be kosher sukkahs, but in fact there was more than 3 tvachim between more than 9 inches between one strap and the next. Okay. Second thing is that if these strings, if you're using these lavud strap strings, they have to be held very taut. Because if they're not perfectly, held really tightly from one side to the other, what's going to happen is, with time, they will, and people bang into them and raining and all kinds of stuff, they will start to sag. So what happens is, if today there was only 8 inches between one string and the next, and that was fine, but with time, if the lower one starts to fall down or droop or get loose or untied from its end, all of a sudden now it's going to be 10 inches and it won't be kosher. Okay, so you have to make sure that in fact it stays. That since you're making these walls based on this whole, you have this whole idea of how you're going to make your walls kosher, you have to make sure they actually are less than 3 tvachim apart, and that they stay less than 3 tvachim apart. Okay, now. This I'm mentioning to you that you could do these lavud straps seems like for a very unusual situation. I mean, how many people want to do that? But in fact, there are many sukkahs that need that, and the reason is like this: if a person makes a sukkah out of a solid wall, out of wood or fiberglass or something solid, or I don't know, bricks for that matter, makes something a solid wall, no problems. It's not going anyplace. However, if you make a sukkah wall out of fabric, what they call canvas, a fabric sukkah, then, what happens is when the wind blows, that fabric will flap around in the wind. There are different shittas about how much flap. A certain amount of flapping is not going to be good. If it flaps around too much in the wind, that's not going to be kosher to be a sukkah. That's not counted as a wall. Okay? Again, even though empty spaces are counted as a wall, but flapping more than a certain amount is not enough. And the Sirac's position on that is it can't flap at all. Okay, so it means is if you're making a sukkah with walls that are canvas, they're going to flap around in the wind. Then you need these lavud straps. Okay, So in other words, you can't, the sukkah might look like it has walls to it. In fact, it does have real walls to it. But in fact, the din looks at it opposite from what it looks like. The fabric walls are not being counted as the walls, and it's those strings, those lovet straps that are making the walls actually be the walls. Okay, so here it is, it seems a little backwards, but that's how it works for this kind of a situation. Okay, now, if that's true, if you have that kind of a sukkah where you're counting on the lovet straps, you have to pay attention to how many walls the straps are around. If the straps only go around 3 walls, then those are the only kosher walls of the sukkah. Okay, 3 walls is enough. But what happens if we have a problem? Like what happens if we have an overhang, overhang of a tree very far over one of those walls? Remember, if it goes too far, it makes the wall puzzle. If it's more than 4 amas, or we have empty space. We'll see more about empty space in a second. It had too much empty space. It could also make a puzzle. So we might end up losing a wall. So you have to pay attention that if we're counting the lovet straps, then the lovet straps are only walls for the walls that actually go around them. Okay, now, another thing to do with walls is that the walls have to, and this has to do with them flapping the wind a little bit, is that the walls of a sukkah need to be able to stand up in ruach mitzuyah, in a typical wind for that area. They have to be, strong enough to stand up to that kind of a storm. Doesn't have to be able to handle a hurricane. Just the regular everyday winds that come in that area, or the weather that comes to that area. That's a little bit part of choosing a location, or when you have your location, you say, is the sukkah that I'm building strong enough to handle the environment that I'm going to be putting it into? So it's not just a convenience that I actually want my sukkah to last through Yom Tov, it's that it has to be strong enough to last through Yom Tov. And therefore, in a normal, if things are as typical, they have to be able to handle that. Okay. Okay. Now, another part of the wall is that the walls, I said, have to only be 10 tefachim tall. They don't have to be 40 inches tall. But the thing says is that once the wall is 10 tefachim tall, it's as if it keeps on going up, straight up to forever, up till the sky. It just keeps on going up. Okay, well, why do I care? I only need 10 tefachim. The answer is like this. After the wall goes up, keeps going up, eventually it comes to the point where it's perpendicular to the schach. Okay, and now we have to watch something. We look at the space where the wall is for pretend away from the schach, or if it's a real wall where it's actually close to the schach, and we can't have more than 3 tefachim, more than 9 inches of empty space between between the wall and the schach. I mean, either the actual wall or the pretend wall that rose up from 10 tefachim high. They can't be more than 3 tefachim empty space. So whereas before I said you could have up to 4 amas of schach puzzle on top. You could have a tree hanging over. That's okay up to 4 amas. You might not be able to eat it, but it won't ruin it. But if you have more than 3 tefachim of empty space, then that wall doesn't count. Okay, that wall is not close enough. Now, again, the wall doesn't actually go up to the schach. The wall only has to be 10 tefachim. But we have an imaginary wall, keep on going up higher, where it's perpendicular to the schach. There has to be less than 3 tefachim of space. And if there's more than 3 tefachim of space, that wall doesn't count and you ruin it. Okay? Now, that's in general when you're building a sukkah. It's particular, we'll hear more about when we talk about mats in a second. It's particular of an issue for them. Okay, we have to make sure that our schach goes within 3 tefachim of where the wall is or where the wall in din considers it to be. Okay, so that's the end of our talking about the walls. Now let's move to the schach. Okay, so the basic rules for schach, 3 basic rules are: the schach has to be something that grows to the ground. The second is it has to be something that is not attached to the ground anymore. And it has to be something that is not makabel tumah. Makabel tumah means it's something that would become tumah if something, let's say, touched a dead body or other kinds of tumah. It has to be something that would not be makabel tumah. Okay, so examples of each of those are: we can't use metal or rocks or plastic because they don't grow from the ground. That was the first problem. We can't use vines or branches that are still attached to the ground because they're still attached to the ground. So they grew on the ground, but they have to also be removed from the ground. And the last rule was it can't be something that's makabel tumah, and because of that, we can't use food. You can't put a bunch of bananas up there to be your schach, and you can't use certain kinds of woven mats because they are also makabel tumah. They think that if they're suitable for uses, that would be makabel tumah. Okay, now once we've chosen what we want to use for our schach, okay, let's say we'll talk about that in a second. We chose something to be schach. We have to put enough schach on there that it it gives more shade than sun, which is to say is the coverage on the top of the sukkah is more than 50% of coverage rather than empty space. So that the solid part of our schach has to be more than 50% on the top rather than and less than 50% of empty space between the pieces of schach. Now, so what do people use? How do they use the schach? So people will use bamboo poles or 1x2 pieces of wood, and they're perfectly fine. They go on the ground, they're not attached to the ground, they're not mekabel, perfect. Other people, and the difficulty with that, those are great for schach. The problem is you have to keep them the whole year round. They take up a lot of space. Okay, so some people use cut branches. They call them greens in some places. They just cut up branches, and so they trim the palm trees before Sukkot, and they just take those branches and put them on top of the sukkah. Those are good for schach also. Okay, but they're disposable, so you don't have to store them from year to year. But of course, you do have to buy new ones every year. Okay, so some people have come up with this idea. They'll use a mat that's made special for sukkahs. Okay, and the mat, the advantage of the mat is that it's small and lightweight, and it's easy to store from year to year. It's easy to put up as well. But in order to make a mat that's kosher, we're not going to talk about what it takes to do that, but in order to make a mat that's kosher, you need to think through all these dinim and make sure you don't make something that's mekabel tumah, and use things that only grow from the ground, etc. All kinds of complexities to doing it. So due to all that difficulty in making a kosher mat, basically people should buy a mat that has a reputable hashgach on it, one that they know, therefore someone's taking responsibility to make sure that these mats are really acceptable, they're really kosher to use for the mitzvah. Okay, so as I said, the advantage of the mat is that it's so small and light and rolls up into a nice little bundle that's easy to store from year to year. But that same advantage is the disadvantage of the mat as well. The disadvantage is that they're so light that winds can blow them off the sukkah. Not only could it blow them off the sukkah, which would be inconvenient, especially if it's on Yom Tov, also you have no sukkah, but they could also move the schach, push it over away from a wall. If it pushes it over more than 3 tvachim from the wall, then, as I said before, now there's an empty space between the wall and the schach, and if the space is more than 3 tvachim, more than 9 inches, then that wall doesn't count anymore. That wall is not part of the sukkah anymore. Forget it. You can't, for sure you can't eat under it, but it's not even part of the sukkah. So the schach mats, because they're so light, and which is their advantage, they're light and they're easy to work with, but they're also light means that the wind can pick them up and move them from here to there. Okay, so that's a problem. So how can we solve that problem? What can we do about these mats to make them not move around during sukkahs? So before I answer that question, I need to digress for a second about another din which has to do also with schach, and that is, I've said already, that schach has to be something that's not mekabel tumah. Okay? Now, so some people say that not only is the schach not able to be mekabel tumah, but the thing that supports the schach, either by holding up the schach or holding down the schach, either one, has to be something that's also not mekabel tumah. We call that a maimed. It can't have a maimed that's mekabel tumah either. Okay? The Mechaber and the Rambam mentioned the Shita, and the Mishabur says that l'chapchila you should be choshesh for that you shouldn't have a maimed which is mekabel tumah. Okay, so that means is that if you have a sukkah made of a metal, the frame of the sukkah is metal, then you should not put on the schach on top of that, because the metal is mekabel tumah. Metal is pretty easy to make it be mekabel tumah, and the metal is mekabel tumah, and therefore what's supporting the sukkah, what's maimed the schach, is metal. But Mishabur says, even though we wouldn't want something to be maimed l'chapchila, we don't want something to be maimed with a mekabel tumah, but if we indirectly support the schach with a mekabel tumah, that's fine, and we call that a maimed dimaimed. If the thing that's holding the sukkah is not mekabel tumah, but that's holding the schach is mekabel tumah, that's good. So, for example, if you have a sukkah with a metal frame, so you wouldn't want to put the schach right on top of the metal frame, but if you put a 2x4 on top of, across from one side of the sukkah to the other, and then put the schach on top of that, that's fine. Because what's going on is that what's supporting the schach is the 2x4. 2x4s are kosher for schach. What's supporting the 2x4 is the metal frame. So the direct maimed of the schach is not mekabel tumah. That's fine. The indirect maimed of the schach, that is to say the metal frame, is mekabel tumah, but that doesn't bother us. The maimed doesn't bother us, and you're allowed to use it. Okay, so that has to do with how you put the schach on top of the wall if the wall is mekabatum. So now let's go back to our schach mats. Okay, we have, I mentioned, our problem that we're trying to deal with is we have schach mats that are going to potentially blow off in not very strong wind. They're going to just blow off. Okay, in everyday wind, they're going to blow off. So if we were to tie down those mats onto the frame of the sukkah as a way to hold them down, then we'll be mimed the mats with something that's not kosher for tzchach. We'd be using a string to tie them down. It's possible to use special strings, but basically, in most cases, strings are going to be not kosher for tzchach. So we can't hold down the tzchach. We can't be mimed the tzchach with this thing that's not kosher for tzchach. So what some people do is they'll put 2x4s on top of the mats. So the 2x4s are heavy enough that they hold down the mats in place. So even when it gets windy, the mats don't have their own weight to hold in place, but the 2x4s keep them in place and make sure that they don't fly around during sukkahs. And that Rabbi Reese said, not only could you use 2x4s, but you could do the following. Remember, I told you, putting down 2x4s underneath the mats, or you could put down 2x4s under the mats in order that they shouldn't be resting on the metal. Then you put down the mat on top of these 2x4s, and then you put another 2x4 on top of that. So we've sandwiched the mat between two 2x4s, or on each side, 2x4s, and then we can cable tie those 2x4s to each other. So what we're doing is, we're sandwiching them together, we're holding them together. So the maimed of the schach is 2x4, that's fine. The maimed of the maimed is a cable tie, and that's fine also. That's only indirect maimed, and therefore it's okay. Okay, so that's a way of doing it in a way that holds the mat in place, keeps it from blowing away in the wind, but keeps the sukkah kosher. Okay, and I'll just repeat that I mentioned earlier that when I'm talking about schach, I'll mention these things we said beforehand, which was that tasser and lemon also means that you have to put on the schach after. You have to put the schach in a way that the sukkah becomes kosher at that time. So first of all, it has to have walls there beforehand. The walls have to be up before the schach goes, or if you're using the straps, those straps have to be up. Straps have to be up before you put up the schach on top of it, and trees have to be trimmed beforehand, or a shlak or awnings have to be pulled away beforehand. All that has to be done before you put up the schach. And we also mentioned about the schach that if there's something overhanging too far, then you may not be allowed to eat under that part of the sukkah, or it might even ruin the whole sukkah altogether. Okay, two last little things, and one is that Rabbi Reese said someone who's not Jewish should not be putting up the schach. There are ways that potentially they could, but basically they should avoid that. If they did do it, then a Jewish person should come along afterwards and lift up the schach a tefach, meaning 4 inches, and then put it back down. So it's as if he is the one who built the sukkah. And last is that if you hang decorations from the sukkah, there shouldn't be such tall decorations that the bottom of the decoration is 4 tvachim, about 12 inches from the schach. Okay, if it hangs down too far, that could also be a problem. But our lights are an exception to that. That they can hang down even more tvachim as long as they're not more than 4 tvachim wide. Okay.